Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Thank you. That was way more energy than I figured after lunch. So this is not a result of the steak lunch, my tummy. In fact, I have a little one on the way, for those of you who are wondering. My parents in particular are particularly excited because I made them wait a really long time to become grandparents. So every phone call with my mom ends with, "I can't wait, I wish the baby was here now." And while my husband and I are extremely excited, we're also kind of glad to have a little more time left to try to prepare as much as one can prepare for your world being turned upside down in a wonderful way. It means that I come to this work in educational equity with fresh eyes, thinking about my little one and what it is, the world that we will offer him or her. And I'm also reflecting on growing up as a Latina, growing up with the pain around language development, right? So my mom, when she was in kindergarten, she was born in Mexico, and when she was in kindergarten, she didn't understand a lot of English, and so she's not sure what she did. She just remembers being put in a corner, and she remembers that she was told to apologize, and she didn't know what that meant. And so after a while, she figured it out, and she went and said she was sorry, and the teacher let her go sit back down. And it was those kind of early years of pain, of not being understood and not having educators who sort of knew what to do with her, that she decided that her children would learn English. And so I'm a lifetime Spanish language learner who's very connected to my cultural identity, but I don't get to kind of have my family's native tongue. And so there's sort of pain on both ends. And the more I've learned about how language development works, it's really unnecessary. It's really unnecessary for kids to be not provided the support to become bilingual and feel really proud in that. There's no reason for there to be a lot of pain around this. And particularly it was Sarah Neville Morgan who talked about the state being a dual language learner state, and she showed some data. I'll show a little bit of data, but there's a lot we can do to really harness the richness of the diversity of California in a culture and language. And so as we think about how to strengthen and expand our early care and education system, it's been on my mind about what it is that we can do so that we don't have experiences like mine or my mom's. And what is it that I can provide to my little one? What kind of experience will they be going through as they go through the system? So this has become very personal to me in a deeper way. So before we get started, I wanted to just kind of share a little bit of information. You've heard today that this is a pivotal moment for so many reasons, that we have leadership from the governor's office, the state superintendent, to our state legislature, who really cares about kids in a way, sort of the cross-section we haven't seen before. And so in this pivotal time is an important time to kind of think about what is the holistic approach we need to be thinking about, and how do we support each other and work together in going through that process. So just a little bit of the landscape. So according to the Getting Down to Facts 2 report, our California's youngest children are the vast majority are kids of color. So 52% Latino, 5% Black, 11% Asian, 26% non-Hispanic white. But California is also home to the largest population of children learning English in addition to their home language. And so in early childhood, we refer to them as dual language learners or DLLs, and in K-12, that's English learners, right? And so But we also know that of our birth to 5 population, it's 60%, as Sarah said earlier, that are dual language learners. And so as we think about the big decisions of the master plan that folks talked about earlier, the data systems, whatever legislative agenda or investments that we're thinking about, making sure that we're designing systems that really reflect our design for our kids to thrive, that looks at our kids, the diversity as assets to build on, as opposed to the need to address their needs, be responsive and address their needs, as if that's something that's not, there's not richness there. There's a lot of richness there, and there's a lot of things that we can do to equip our workforce from birth to 12 to know exactly what to do. We have the research, we have the pedagogy, we have the practice and approaches, and we have to support our workforce to know what to do so that we have thriving teachers supporting thriving kids. So part of what we know comes from the National Academies of Sciences, and this confirms what we've known, right? We now have research consensus that children are wired to learn any language successfully in the world. They can learn more than one language, that home language is in fact a strong foundation for learning English and overall academic achievement, and that 2 languages or more really makes strong brains for supporting success long term. So it's not about confusing kids, but so that we have the brain science that tells us this is really powerful. So the cross-section of the power of early childhood and the power of language development, we really need to harness that in California. The research also tells us that quality and quantity matter. So parents should be speaking to their kids in their strongest language. A lot of families think that their kids need to learn English, and so they're using their broken English to speak to them, and they're not modeling quality language. And when we don't know as educators to guide them to do differently, they're going to continue to do that, and that part of what erodes kind of the foundation that they're working from home. So quality and quantity matter. That in fact, if you take a look at what the kids know in their home language and English, their vocabulary is comparable with the rest of their peers. And that, so we need to have their home language to continue to develop as well as we're developing English. So no one's saying that English is not important. We're saying that the home language is a foundational piece, and so the stronger that is, the stronger their English is going to be, and the stronger, more opportunities they have to reach their potentials and be successful across their journey in education system. So we really need to be concerned when we start seeing kids lose their home language for so many reasons, from the academics, but like how they define themselves, like their culture, their connection to families, and those kinds of things. All that is part of what sets kids up for success, or what they struggle with to kind of the barriers that they have to go over, right? So we all know that the early years are critical years, and this is true for language development. This comes from Patricia Kuehl's work. So having high quality language in the earliest years, and that home language and English, right, super important. And so in sort of the last slide here is, in 2016, Proposition 58 was passed by almost 75% of the voters. It was a proposition that was about supporting more opportunities for bilingual education for all kids, which was fantastic to see such strong public will on this area. The other thing that it did is it undid the harmful policies of the past, right? Which was wonderful, but it meant we needed a new policy. And so this policy is called the California English Learner Roadmap State Policy. It was passed by the State Board of Education in 2017. It is early childhood through to 12th grade. It is assets-based. It is based on current research. It is aligned with our policies. It declares bilingualism and biliteracy as a goal. And it also has clarity at the state level that all educators in early childhood and K-12 are responsible for supporting these kids. These are our kids. So that means that any other policy, any of the other big decisions that we're making in early childhood and beyond need to be in alignment with this policy, this wonderful policy that we have. So, as part of that context, we see this as an umbrella policy, and we also want to see that with these very exciting opportunities in the master plan and the data systems and whatever the legislative agenda is in the next and continuing seasons, what is it that we should be doing and thinking about to make sure is a part of that conversation? As the state works to expand and strengthen our early care and education system, if we do that and don't bring the majority of the population to the center of how we define and support quality, we will create a system that does not work for the majority of our kids, right? And we can't afford to do that. So, thinking about that, we've been partnering with Early Edge California and Dr. Marlene Zepeda and a number of all of you to think about what are the policy levers we need to be thinking about for systemic change. So it's not about the laundry list of all the things we wish we can see in the system, but if we had a handful of things that maybe our governor took action on, or our state legislature took action on, or a state superintendent took action on, in some way that opened the door for us to be able to do the rest of the work, what would those be? So for example, if we know that the child development permit, right, the requirements for a teacher to be in the early childhood classrooms, if we know that's going to be revised, and leadership said, well, dual language learner training needs to be a part of that. If that was required, that would mean professional development would change. That would mean higher ed teacher prep would change. That would mean curriculum would change. So that's an example of a high level lever that we're trying to think about. And then we can get to the rest of it once we start seeing that systemic change really take shape, right? So we put together a drafty draft, that's a term I learned from Camille Maven, a drafty draft of a policy platform, which you saw on your chairs. And so today's conversation is with folks who have helped inform that and to really kind of talk about what those critical issues are. And so that's the context, and I'm sorry I'm talking too much, but I just want to make sure we're all kind of up to speed on our conversation. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Marlene Zepeda, and I have your title here somewhere, but I lost my notes. Dr. Marlene Zepeda is a professor emeritus from Department of Child and Family Studies at Cal State Los Angeles. We have Patricia Lozano, who's executive director of Early Edge California. We have Lupe Jaime, senior director of Early Care and Education at Fresno County Superintendent of Schools, as well as Soodie Ansari, the coordinator for the Early Learning Language Support at San Mateo County Office of Education, and Dean Tagawa, from Executive Director of Early Childhood Division with Los Angeles Unified. So if we could just welcome our guests. So Ms. Marlene, you have been really helpful to us in terms of being the lead researcher and writer on this project. Can you talk to us a little bit about the kind of conversations you've had, the key insights that you're pulling from your conversations with the field, and how we get to some of the themes that we're seeing in this policy platform?
Right. Thank you, Vickie. I think that we've already heard earlier today about how we are at a pivotal moment, a momentous moment in early learning for the state of California, given the leadership and the focus on the master plan. So when this master plan came up, I was approached to think about what is the role of DLL, or how do DLL children fit within this master plan. That was sort of the initial thinking. So we need to think about early childhood being at a pivotal time. But similarly, we have to think about bilingual education being at a pivotal time. With the passage of Proposition 58 and the Early Learning English Language Roadmap, we are at a very important time for bilingual ed. Bilingual education in the state of California has been defunct for about close to 20 years. And for us to move to begin to try to shore that up and really focus on bilingual education in a more systematic way, in a way that is supported by the majority of voters in the state of California, is very important. It's sending a very clear message. The other issue, and Sarah Neville Morgan actually was instrumental when she was at First Five California, because First Five California, Camille can tell you what the date was for the strategic plan, where they inserted language in their strategic plan that they were going to do a dual language learner pilot. And we bugged her and bugged her and bugged her about it. And they began to develop an advisory committee and form this dual language learner pilot. But one of the issues that we had in trying to describe our population of children is data. It's very difficult to have data on through our mixed delivery system for the 0 to 5 population. And so they went and they looked at census data, they looked at the UCLA interview data, and came out with a statistic of 60%, and she had that on her slide earlier today, which means that the majority of children under the age of 6 in the state of California come from a home where English is not the primary language or another language other than English is spoken. So it's sort of a mixed bag, because in a lot of cases, children have older siblings who are speaking English and they're hearing some English that's coming into the home, or other family members. So the issue of just even knowing who our children are is a big deal, and it continues to be a big deal in terms of identification of dual language learners. So for early childhood, what we're thinking about, or really the challenge for me as an early childhood person, has been how do we make DLLs part of the early childhood narrative? How do they become not an ad hoc add-on to some policy somewhere, but really part of and parcel of what we do systemically in early childhood. I want to give a shout out, if you have not seen the Advancing Equity Statement by the National Association for Education for Young Children. You all know NAYC, right? Yes. Go on their website. There is a policy statement there that is going to blow your mind, because it basically says that we need to provide our children with equitable learning opportunities, and that early educators, it is our ethical obligation to provide those learning opportunities to our children in order to be fair and to be socially just. So I would encourage you to go look at that, because this is not only an issue for us in California, it is an issue that is going on across the nation, because the child population across the nation has changed dramatically. And early childhood organizations are recognizing that. So that's sort of like the big picture. Now, one of the things that has also moved the issue or the dial for us, and tell me when my time's up, because I can talk a lot, that has really moved the dial for us a lot in thinking about bilingual child growth and development is the brain research. The brain research has concretely demonstrated what happens in the brain of a bilingual child compared to a monolingual child. And there are certain advantages associated with being bilingual, that actually you have more brain tissue. If some of you are bilingual, you know your head, you've got to work harder. You have to suppress one language to think about the ideas in another language. So there is increased meta-linguistic awareness, more focused attention. So there's real benefits, and for us old geezers, it helps with Alzheimer's disease. It's true, dementia. So what we did was, that's sort of the landscape. So what we did was we looked to see how could we begin to think about incorporating the importance or just the presence of DLLs within policy and educational policy in the state of California. And as much as people give lip service, and I don't mean that too derogatorily, to DLLs and the importance of honoring the home culture and all that jazz, we are invisible in state policy. We are not mentioned in the child development permit, the new teacher performance competencies that came out from the Commission on Teacher Licensing. We yelled and screamed about just even putting language and culture into it. And now we have the EL roadmap, but a lot of stuff, and I apologize to my State Department of Education folk, a lot of stuff that comes from the State Department of Education is non-regulatory guidance. What does that mean? You don't have to do it. So that is a concern that I have from being in this field for a long time, that I know that we have a tradition of local control and all that in the context, and I realize that. But without the state taking a proactive position on the importance of educating children to maximize their learning in an appropriate way, which means supporting the home language in various forms and fashions, that leaves it as a voluntary exercise in implementation. And so we need to think about, I don't want to force people to do things, but we also have to think about who our children are. What do we want for these children? How are they going to be, how are we going to help them be the best that they can be within this educational trajectory? 30 to 50% of children who start kindergarten, it's in the platform, 30 to 50% of children, this comes from Lori Olson, who start kindergarten not speaking English are going to land up as long-term English learners, which means they're at higher risk for school dropout and for not fulfilling their economic promise. So these are very serious realities for a lot of our children. And so I think we are at a time where let's think about early childhood. That's when language really starts, and think about infusing a DLL perspective within policy. And then, I know I'm going over time. And then the EL roadmap, which Vickie mentioned, was adopted by the State Board of Education in 2017. One of the themes that is coming up and has been coming up in conversations with not only here in California, but I think across the nation, is the whole notion of alignment, this cradle to career notion, that we have to think about early childhood from birth to third grade. And what does that trajectory look like? This 1 year of preschool for, half day for 6 months and everything's going to be wonderful? No. That's not how it works. We have to look more long-term. We have to think about a more cohesive system. And so in the roadmap, you're going to see how we have adopted the English Language Learner Roadmap as our umbrella for beginning to have this conversation about DLLs. I was surprised to hear Kim Patella-Bronson, I don't think she's in the audience anymore, she's on our state board this morning, say that 2/3 of LEAs have early childhood programs in them. Mm-hmm. Well, the reality is that the K-12 system is, in fact, overseeing early childhood programs, including with infants and toddlers. What do they know about infants and toddlers? What do they know about preschool? We have very different philosophies and theoretical orientations. So this whole issue of alignment merits conversation. The issue of quality counts, and I know I'll get in trouble for saying stuff, but quality counts doesn't address DLLs. It's a supplemental criteria. Some of my colleagues will be talking about that. This is something we've been bugging about, and also bugging Camille about, because we bug you a lot, Camille, because when the quality rating improvement system started, remember way back when, it was not developed with diverse children in mind. It was developed for what I call the generic child. That good quality is good quality, and all children will benefit from good quality. That was the refrain I would get when I was out talking to people. But the fact of the matter is, DLLs need good quality, that's baseline, but they also need special accommodation. They need special pedagogical adjustments in the curriculum for them. And that is not being addressed within the QRS as in general. Is that my note to stop?
I think what I think is important to note, though, is this is more than just bilingual programs. There are strategies and pedagogy and approaches that can be used whether you're monolingual, whether you share the language of those children you're serving or not. And there are a number of things that we can do in the system. It's important to start having these conversations and start having coming to some plans on what are our initial steps to address those, and how do we take leadership in California. So I think there's plenty of opportunities. We have some folks here who have taken leadership in their own roles, and what is it we can learn from them, and how can that inform and strengthen the systems that we have? Because I think folks are open to the conversation. It's just about figuring out kind of where we start. I think the pilot that Marlene mentioned from First 5 California is an excellent opportunity to do some learning and figure out how we want to prioritize our energy, because we can't do everything at once, but we want to think about what are the strategic steps we can take that really begin to change systems. So I want to ask Patricia, who's been very involved in the development of the platform, to share a little bit about the process and what are some opportunities that you've seen in this work so far.
Thank you. So first, I wanted to acknowledge the team that was behind this work, both the Advancement Project on Early Edge, Caroline Crolot and Yoon Hee, somewhere, yay, because they've been working really hard, and I'm just here communicating about it. So the process started this year around April, and we were thinking, well, we have this huge opportunity with the master plan. And we know DLLs cannot be just a separate group that we may think about, but how do we make it like structural? So we started thinking about, well, let's write something around the key recommendations for the master plan to consider. And the team, with Marlene's help, wrote the recommendations that you have on your tables, the draft, and went out and to many different meetings to really be sure to hear all the voices that needed to be heard. Because as we know, there are so many programs that DLLs are at. We need to know the parent perspective, we need to know the teacher perspective, and we need to know the connection between policy and practice. So now we're celebrating that we have a draft to share, but this is all still a draft, and hopefully you will have the time to look at it and give us feedback if you think we're missing something, or if something that is not clear, or because the objective is to connect with Janina and Chris and say, here is this document with recommendations that were vetted with many, many stakeholders, so they have a start point to integrate to the master plan. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to add anything else, Vickie, from the process, because you were also involved.
Oh, no, that's good, that's good.
Yeah.
They wanted us to do it like in 6 weeks. I'll add that.
Yeah.
No, just that we know our work is not done. There's, on page 11, you'll see that there's a couple email addresses that you can write to with your feedback. You can reach us that way. But we really do want to hear. During our July water cooler, we actually had a draft of the policy ideas and said, tell us what you love, tell us what you hate, tell us what you want to see tweaked. So to the extent that we can have this larger conversation, we really invite you all to help us with this thinking, because we want this to be an important resource for the years to come, but particularly for this really important year ahead. Ms. Lupe, you in Fresno have been doing a lot of great leadership around dual language learners in various different approaches, from workforce to your quality counts work. Can you give us an overview of what that work has looked like and what has been meaningful, and what are some of the things you need to systemically to be able to do even more?
Yeah. So in Fresno, we had a couple efforts happening at the same time, and I can honestly say that because those happened at the same time, it really helped to align the work that we have today. On one end, there was, we had a consortium who was very vocal about ensuring that dual language learners who were recognized somewhere in the QRS matrix locally, and wanting to know how can we make that work. And so it took several months, but as a result, we had decided to add what we call a local requirement, meaning that if someone is going through the QRS system and they are being rated and they accumulate X amount of points, if they don't meet that local requirement, even if they have done enough work to get a 5-star, because we're stars in Fresno County, then they will remain a 4. That's a bold statement to say you have to meet these elements locally and to demonstrate that you are able to support dual language learners. I think that was a value statement that we made that sent, I think, an impact across the county alone. And so that was one of the pieces that we did. I will say, though, that our family childcare homes and our center base are scoring a 5. Some people say, well, maybe there is, how does this sector look versus this sector? And if you look at our 200 sites that are currently participating, they're faring quite well because it's embedded in the system, which I think needs an applause, sorry. That's pretty neat, if you think about that. The other piece that was happening at the same time was an investment from Packard Foundation through the Starting Smart and Strong work. And they did a 10-year investment in Fresno looking at supporting our efforts. And they called together a group. And of course, none of this work that we can do is without partnerships. And the group got together that would include Fresno Unified as the lead, County Office of Ed, Resource and Referral, because we want to make sure that we know that children come from different places, not just from a district lens, but they could come from our family childcare home or family, friends, and neighbors. And then Head Start and Early Head Start. And we pretty much started off with looking at our data, looking at our graduation rates, which weren't the greatest, looking at our redesignation or reclassification rates, which weren't as high either, and having some honest conversations about where we want to be. And as a result, what stood out was the DLL rate more than anything. And so that, through that data, that then shifted our efforts to support and have an investment made around DLL. But it was very specific to make sure that it was representation of the 0 to 5 sector and not just a certain sector, and that everyone where children will walk through the doors with their families was represented of that, which we refer to as the mixed delivery system. So what was birthed then from this work was what we call a Fresno Language Lab. And it's a PLC that meets 5 times a year with embedded coaching, and you have practitioners in the room, representative of all these different sectors, including our family childcare home providers. And then you also have leadership there, because one of the pieces that we're looking systemically was that practitioners can go to these professional growth trainings, but when they cannot implement in their settings because maybe the higher ups don't quite understand or are not aligned with what is the latest research, then you have a disconnect. So myself, my counterpart at Fresno Unified, Deanna, who's the early learning director, who's somewhere here, as well as the Resource and Referral ED, Head Start ED, and site supervisors were all in the room, and we were learning together. And I think that helped also sustain, that helped kind of think about our system collectively and ensure that we were each discussing this work together. The other piece that we also had happening concurrently was that we were tapped by Fresno State to start a what they call a multilingual, multicultural master's degree. And we were also wanting to bring back the old BCLAD, which now is called the BAP, the Bilingual Authorization in Hmong and Spanish. And it was very strategic where one of the colleagues of my friends, Dr. Teresa Huerta, tapped into me and said, can you help co-facilitate? And we said, well, we do co-facilitate this work to bring these degrees into place. We have to make sure we have the representation of the continuum. So I called a good friend of mine from the higher ed, and we both led it through co-lead, and it was a cross-sector across this to bridge those worlds together. So we still have some work to do in that area, but we were successful with a new president coming into Fresno State to adopt those two degrees, which I think helped then be able to help with the pipeline also of this work too. And then finally, because of the work that was done with Starting Smart and Strong, when the $5 million investment came in, you know, through CDE and then of course their early age, then we were tapped into to try to scale our work. So we're scaling it out, and Tulare and Kern, we're utilizing lessons learned from our previous year, our humble years, our humble beginnings, where we failed forward on a few areas, and we're bringing that out to them, and then we're also supporting them with the coaching. Because that was another finding we had, was that if your coaches are not aligned with this nuance of research and support and et cetera, there's gonna be a mixed match of the messages that they're receiving. And you have to remember, the workforce gets a lot of different coaches from all different sectors. So for for Fresno County, it was important for us to bring all the coaches together to have some common language and form their own PLC and lead that work together, so then when they're out in the field, then they're receiving the same type of message. So the infomercial is that at the end of next year, we'll be doing in the spring the toolbox, the toolkit orientation. We'll be doing a couple institutes across the state in case anyone wants to have it come to their home. And then we'll be able to talk about this work. But I do have to say that this work wasn't alone. You have to have a buy-in of the different sectors that are involved in this work. You have to be representatives of children from prenatal to 5, and then do the articulation with your districts. And then finally, you also have to make sure that it's embedded into a system, like in our case, QCC, which then helps support the, the streamlining of this effort too.
You mentioned a whole lot of amazing things that you all have been doing. One of the things you mentioned is the $5 million. Patricia, do you want to give just a brief overview about what that is?
Yeah, as you were talking, it's like, yay, it's connection between policy and practice, right? Because we were behind the advocacy of getting additional funding for programs who are in early learning. And what happened was that there was an initial money for K-12, and we're like, what about early learning? That's where all the kids, the DLLs are. So, everything went well, and as Sarah Neville Morgan mentioned, CDE provided grants to key, training PD models across the state, one being Fresno. And it's amazing to see the progress and see how we're collecting data, we're connecting with you and all the other grantees to really understand what does it mean from beginning to end when you, as an advocate, go try to get the money, and then what's the implementation? Because one thing is the idea, and we need additional funding, but then what happens when it gets to you, right? And all these lessons learned, and we're lucky enough to have support from philanthropy to really collect data and be able to tell the story back to the state and say, yes, this is working. Obviously, the main thing is we need more. There is such a great demand for these trainings, and the teachers are so hungry for this. And what we see is, like, we survey them at the beginning, and there's a huge need because of our population. We need to know how to work with kids who don't speak English. And then after one training, the change is amazing, right? It's like, obviously we need to see if it's gonna stay, a lot of other variables, but it's amazing to see it happening, and we're very excited, and this is giving us more data to say this should be more, and for all programs, for all kids in California, and it should be not just one time, but part of just the training for all teachers and providers.
Thank you. We had the opportunity to go to Fresno for a visit. Lupe and her team were so generous to give her to give us some of their time. And we went to several site visits, a couple of which included family child care providers. And these family child care providers, both women, totally separate homes, both happened to be serving children for about 18 years. And they were Spanish dominant women. And so I remember going and we asked, so you're fluent in Spanish, you're obviously running your program in Spanish. How has the training that you've been receiving made a difference for you? And they both said the very same thing. They said that they spoke to kids in their home language, but now they understood the pedagogy. Now they understood the role and how that translates to the development of English. Now they understood the strategies that they should be using for the quality and quantity and those kinds of things. And it totally changed their world. And they had been doing this for a really long time, but they felt more confident in their teaching, and they were really confident in knowing that what they were doing was making an important impact and getting them ready for the K-12 system. So it's more than just sharing a language. It's really understanding what it is the kids need and how to respond to that, right? And so that's what's been really wonderful to learn about what's happening in Fresno, and I'm sure we'll have similar stories in San Mateo and Los Angeles. So Soodie, you have been working for a number of years on issues of family engagement and DLLs. Can you share a little bit about the work you've been doing and the kind of systemic change that would help you move forward?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So I have to thank our funders, local San Mateo, First 5 San Mateo and W.K. Kellogg Foundation that made this work possible in San Mateo County. We've been able to develop a pretty comprehensive DLL professional development model that includes modules for early learning educators and administrators. And this year, we've had the opportunity to work closely with Dr. Carola Oliva-Olsen. You've heard her name mentioned a few times today, and she, through Channel Islands CSU, another grantee of the 5 million DLL PD grant. And what we were able to do was expand the work that we've done thus far in San Mateo County to include more specifically the POLE strategies, the personalized oral language learning strategies that our friends in Fresno have been working on and mastering, and we've been learning from. So that's quite exciting. And the work that Channel Islands is leading are the online courses, and what we're doing in San Mateo, Santa Clara, Alameda, and Santa Barbara are 4 face-to-face cohorts that we're leading and really looking at this content and building on what we have been doing. And really, it's just a different format. So we are bringing the teachers and administrators together in a face-to-face capacity. The other piece that we've developed in San Mateo County is a parallel series of interactive workshops for families of children with home languages other than English, with content that's very much aligned with the modules that we've developed for the providers. I think by now you can tell that one of the unique components about our PD is the focus on family engagement, and that focus is actually a very specific intentional strategy to create and to foster linguistically and culturally responsive curricula and learning experience for the children. We heard earlier in the data presentation today that the path forward was authentic engagement of students, families, educators, and communities. So we've really taken the family engagement piece to heart, knowing that, backed by research, that without authentic engagement of families, we can't possibly be creating curricula and learning experiences for our children that are truly relevant and responsive to their needs. So with what Marlene mentioned earlier, the adjustments and the enhancements and the modifications that we need to be making in our classrooms, in our learning settings, must be informed by what we learn from the families. So that's one of the, that is the unique component with our professional development model. The other piece that we have, so we are trying to come at the family engagement piece from a multi-pronged approach. And the other strategy that we launched in San Mateo County in 2016 is the Friday Cafe standing for Community and Family Engagement, which is a professional learning, an unconventional professional learning community. I can talk about specifics of it another time later. But it's specifically designed for family engagement practitioners in early learning. And it's meant to bring together family engagement practitioners on a monthly basis to be in conversation with one another, with peer support, around what is most present and relevant on the minds of our practitioners who are working with the majority of our diverse families, many who are immigrant families. In the recent past, I think we all know how tense and anxiety-driven the experience has been for our families, particularly our immigrant families, and the impact that has on our children, on our dual language learners who are in school. And so really equipping the family engagement practitioners to hold that anxiety, to really be present with the families, and to support the family engagement practitioners to then be able to go out and do the work that they do. Another piece that we have brought, or the model and approach that we've brought to the county, is the Parent Cafe model, which I'm sure many are familiar with. Again, trying all of these efforts are with the intention to move away from doing to families and more towards doing with families, and really partnering with families and with the intent to learn and to really gain input that can then inform children's experiences and children and students' experiences at school. And the Parent Cafe model, again, surely many are familiar with, but that is also a model that is very much not content-driven per se, but really more about peer relations and peer support, where families are in conversation with one another, and it's a wonderful platform to hear from families, and really for school staff, for educators, for administrators to be present, to be part of the conversation, and learn from families so that then it can inform the work at school and in learning environments. So all of our efforts are really about supporting dual language learners by lifting up the voices of our diverse families to where the voices are respected, valued, and quite frankly, sought after by our educators and by our administrators, where the value in that input is really understood, so that it can inform the work that we do with our dual language learners.
Thank you so much. So, Mr. Dean, we have some really exciting work that's happened at LA Unified, that cross-section of early childhood and dual language learners. Can you talk a little bit about what the district is doing and from a district perspective?
Sure. I was going to say, just from the crowd, how many of you were up before 7 a.m. this morning getting here? Okay, so I can kind of relate to you a little bit. I guess on Friday, you mentioned kind of interesting things in LA Unified, and when I first saw the question, I was thinking, well, we had fires, we've had floods, we've had work stoppages, but dual language, okay, we can get there. And I was thinking on Friday morning, the morning started kind of that way. I got a call at 3:37 in the morning, and I remember thinking, who is calling me at 3:30 in the morning? And I picked up the phone, decline, turned it back over, and then I thought, you know, I think those first 3 digits were the district headquarters. Let me pick that back up. And I looked, and sure enough, it was the district headquarters, and they were saying, we need you to show up at the Emergency Operations Center as soon as you can. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it's 3:30 in the morning. So I got there, and sure enough, it was about the fires. And so, so while we were sitting there at the Emergency Operations Center, I remember going through all the questions and thinking, this is really what I want to talk about. I really don't want to know if all the lunches are getting to the schools and how many truck drivers are out there and how many buses are on issues. And that's really important too. But the dual language part, and I think as we began this dual language work, and it was almost 3 years ago, and we started with a cohort of 13 schools in early education in a variety of kind of programs. So we had transitional kindergarten programs, we had expanded transitional kindergarten programs, we had center-based programs, we had half-day state preschool programs, and we even had what we called a PCC, a preschool collaborative classroom that had children with special needs incorporated with their general education students. And so we did Spanish and Korean that first year, and we rolled it out and we started. And I had heard it said that, you know, like they had interviewed all these people who were really, really smart. And they said, you know, what was one of the findings that came out of that? You know, these people who had high IQs and were highly intelligent. And the first thing that came up was they were very acutely aware of what they didn't know. And so even though LA Unified had been doing early education, or had been doing early education, but had been doing dual language programs for a long period of time, when you put the two together, early education and dual language, it was really obvious we didn't know a lot. Yeah. And so in that starting place is where we began, and we started reaching out to, you know, all of our folks. We had different, you know, advocacy groups. We had different school districts. Have you done anything with dual language? And I remember thinking back just 3.5 years ago, calling Florida, Educare, because they had been doing something. And even what they were doing was very different than what we were thinking about. And so starting backwards and really thinking about what do we need to do this right. Marlene Zepeda, I mean, we started reaching out to everybody we could ask, Advancement Project, Early Edge, people who had been across the state. Have you heard anybody doing anything around this work? Who could we call? Who do we know? And so the Sobrato Early Academic Language Foundation is one of the groups that we talked to. And we started asking them, okay, so we know you're doing some work in these areas. Could you share a little bit more about how you got that going? And what were some of those lessons that you learned? I'm really good at making mistakes. You know, anybody that's worked with me knows that, you know, hey, Mr. Tagawa makes a lot of mistakes. You know, eventually we get it right, but we reflect on those. And in this case, we had 30,000 kids, and I remember thinking, I don't want to get this wrong. You know, so let me reach out to some of these other folks that have been doing this, and so we can help get it right from the very beginning. So it took about 5 months of planning. We met with teachers and principals, school board members, Long Beach Unified School District, all these different advocacy groups, anybody who'd been working in that dual language space to kind of develop our program and how are we going to put this together. And so after 2 years, we did some really good work. And I have to say that it was not just me, it was really a team. We worked with our Division of Instruction, our multicultural, multilingual education department to help us with a lot of those pieces. We even reached out to our federal, state, and education programs branch because we needed funding. So where were we going to get the funding to bring in teachers and aides and subs? And so we used Title II funding, and so we put in a big ask for Title II funding, which was around professional development. So that piece of getting everything going was so critical in us getting started. So we're now in our first new cohort of schools, and we have 13 schools that are doing it. This year we've added Spanish, but we've added Armenian and Mandarin. So we're pretty excited, and we've added 2 more what we call preschool collaborative classrooms. So even kids who have special needs can be learning from this. So yeah, we're really excited about where it's headed.
Thank you. So we have just heard about, you know, from different parts of the state, district, county, working with family child care providers, thinking about it from a policy perspective. You all have been doing amazing work. The policy platform elevates three main areas. The English Learner Roadmap State Policy, that there needs to be some alignment there. Workforce and quality. If you are doing this work, what systemic change do you need to go further? What are the things in workforce, or what are the things in quality that, that would be helpful to you? For example, Lupe, you guys have been working with your QRS program. How is it that what kind of action do you need from the state level to allow you guys to do more of that?
I think that we have to see dual language as everything that we do in our work. That means that we should constantly have that lens when we're rolling out our effort. For example, us being bold and embedding it into our matrix, right? Now sends out a North Star and a value. And so as we're looking at this master plan, for instance, and we're looking at all these different sectors, even facilities, for example, that you think, well, facilities and dual language. Believe it or not, it is the lens that you have to use when you're doing this work all together, because that is a large section of the population. And I know we gave the number of 60% of the children, but I would argue that that might even be higher, only because if you remember, most parents self-identify, right, whether their child is dual language. So if you have, in the climate that we are in right now, some families may choose not to self-identify because they don't want to put an extra target on our children. So I really would push that, to do our work well, we should not have Fresno do a workaround to be able to meet the children. It should be embedded already across our systems. And the other piece is making sure that our information then is being able to be passed on, our data, to our K-12 or TK-12 partners, right? So then you're able to have that information early enough, and you have that articulation done. It should not be a 0 to 5 and then it stops here. Then the parent shows up for the first day of school and then has to retell their story all over again and start that process all over again within their own systems. Those are things we can tighten up from an ask if I had, my way of being able to influence the work.
And if I can add, I feel like from the policy perspective, and here's where the voice of all key stakeholders is so important. So it's not just us, we're advocates, we believe in it, it's what we do. But if everybody that is serving a DLL at any level sees this is a structural, this is not just this group of kids or this group of families, it should be part of all the system, when you're talking about facilities, when you're talking about financing, when you're talking about the workforce. All dual language learners need to have access to high quality programs, and we know that usually they don't. But if it's only us saying it, it's not as powerful, and that's why this process of engaging all these key stakeholders is so important, because if the state hears it from all of you, it's different. So I think it's more like this is an issue that is just from the system and for the system.
Thank you. Dean, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the articulation piece is really, really critical. Yeah. When we started investing into our dual language programs, one of the things we did was we really looked at if we're going to do a dual language at such and such early ed center, where are those kids going to go? Are they going to be able to continue that trajectory? Because we had a vision of these kids who are starting in these dual language programs ultimately walking across the stage as seniors with that California seal of biliteracy. I mean, that's what we wanted for those kids. The other part of it is, so when we looked at those places, did they have a feeder pattern? Was there an elementary school that would take these kids regardless of their boundaries? And then from there, did the elementary schools now have a feeder pattern for middle school? The kids could continue on that trajectory. And did they have a feeder pattern to a high school? So I think as we kind of look for state, support, we really need to start really also tapping into our institutes of higher ed. Because now we're struggling as a district. We have over 300 of these dual language programs. Kids are getting now through elementary school and getting to middle school, and guess what? There's no path for them to continue. There's no chemistry teachers that have a single subject, but also have the ability to speak, another language. And then they get to high school, and it's the same thing. And that was something that as we invested in our early ed programs, we wanted to make sure that all of these programs had a path for the kids to continue on. They had an articulation between the elementary school and the early education program. And to some extent, I think if the state could chip in to make sure that we had those kind of supports in place, that would make a huge difference for our kids and our families as they really work to both, and I'm going to say, retain their language, but also their cultural heritage. So I think that's a big piece.
And what do you think would be, to the panel, one of the most important things we could do to support workforce development, to have more of this focus area of dual language learners?
We have to institutionalize it. We have to memorialize it. We have to have it in policy. It has to be stated policy. I'm a higher education alum. We only respond to what we have to respond to in our accreditation. If it is not required, we don't necessarily do it unless there's a particular faculty member that wants to do it. It is challenging because early childhood has some of, particularly at the community college level, we have some of the lowest requirements in the nation to work with young children in California. And so when I talk to my community college colleagues, they say, we'd love to do that, Marlene, but we have to do trauma-informed care, we have to do special needs, we have to pack all of this into 12 units or 24 units. And so it's always seen as a one of many in a laundry list of diversity issues. So for example, the CAP 8 has a diversity course. The students are expected to take a diversity course, but there's no specific course on DLL or no specific emphasis on DLL within the CAP 8. So that's one of our recommendations is let's revisit the CAP 8. Because once the CAP 8 went into existence, these were courses that were required at the community college. There was legislation passed that required the four-year institution to accept those CAP 8 courses. You know what, the four-year, a lot of us weren't happy about that because we don't like to be told what to do. But we had to do it because it was legislated. And it followed the pattern that nurses used for articulation from a 2-year to a 4-year institution. So this happens, the state legislature said, you guys got to articulate. This is an inefficient use of our taxpayer dollar. You have to articulate. So, I have seen it when it is mandated, and we don't like mandates, but when it is mandated, the institutions of higher education respond. They have to. They have to. And so that is the beef I have with the CTC is that it's not required. And we would like to see, and also the CTC needs to have early childhood expertise on the commission. Because we go in front of that commission, and sometimes we do have some supportive people there. We have an ex officio, they don't vote. But we don't have supporters on the commission or people that can voice our concerns on the commission. There is a real need across the state to have expertise at all of these decision-making places to raise and elevate this issue to the conversation so that it becomes part and parcel of what it is that we're talking about when we're talking